Hi everybody, my name is Hank Boyle. I'm with the, and this is Chad Jones. We're part of the National Tile Contractors Association training team. And today we're talking about tiling on exteriors. So when we're doing an exterior, it's important to remember that not all materials are rated for exteriors. Thin set, mortars, you would think that they're all the same, but generally they need to be rated, well, they always need to be rated and tested to be used on an exterior, as well as the application that you're using. So the type of climate that you live in will come into play with that, whether it's a hot climate, cold climate, freeze thaw. These are all things you need to talk about with the manufacturer before you start an exterior project and select which materials that you're going to use. So make sure your materials are approved. And then also, what are you tiling over? Is that on a slab on grade? Is that a roof deck? Is that a patio? Is it over an occupied living space? There's different requirements for any application that you're going to be doing. And when it comes to exteriors, you see the most failures in this industry. And so you need to pay attention to all the details. So if you're going over an occupied living space, you're going to need a primary roofing membrane to be installed before you actually start with your tile assembly, and then select a product and method that can be used in that application.
And that primary waterproofing membrane or roofing membrane would be installed by others. That's not our business. So we don't want that culpability. We just push that off on them, and then we go from there.
Right. I'm not a roofing contractor. Chad's not a roofing contractor, but we are tile guys. So we know tile, and we let the roofing guys do roofing, right?
Yep.
So the first thing in this particular job right here, we're going over a slab on grade. So we don't need to worry about the primary roofing membrane because it's not as critical in this installation, but what we're trying to do here is get that moisture that gets into our tile assembly out of it and give it a way to drain out. So there's a couple of different methods to do that, and we're going to go over this one that includes a drainage mat. But before we get started, we want to make sure that we have the appropriate slope in our substrate. An exterior horizontal surface is considered a wet area. So just like a shower floor, we need to make sure that we have the appropriate slope. The minimum slope for a wet area is 1/4 of an inch per foot. No more than 1/2 of an inch per foot. So for every foot we go out, we need 1/4 of an inch of drop, but no more than 1/2 inch. So Chad,
in this case, we have 3/8, which is right in that sweet spot between the two.
Right, just enough. So mentioning the slope, the other requirement is substrate flatness. The industry, as a whole, has developed a standard for substrate flatness, and that is 1/4 of an inch, or if it's a tile that is under 15 inches, then our requirement for flatness is 1/4 of an inch and 10 feet. If we're setting a large format, what's considered a large format tile, that's a tile with any side larger than 15 inches is considered a large format tile. The requirement then changes to 1/8 of an inch and 10 feet, and no more than 1/16 of an inch and 24 inches. So the way we check that, since we got to go check a 10-foot span, we're going to need a 10-foot straight edge or a 10-foot screed. You can't check for floor flatness in a 10-foot area with a 4-foot level. So we're going to use a 10-foot screed. Is this flat enough to install a large format tile over, Chad?
Plenty. Yeah, we're maximum of about 1/8 of an inch out.
Perfect. So we made sure that we had the appropriate slope. We've made sure that it's flat. The first thing that we're doing with this, there's a couple of different methods now that we can use to evacuate water away from our tile assembly on an exterior. So coming from the NTCA handbook, which this has all the methods that you would want to use in the the tile industry. If you need to tile it, the method to do so is in this book, and it's important to stay within the guidelines here. So when you're talking about drainage, moisture getting underneath the tile assembly, the methods are F103 and F103B. So all these methods have a diagram, and they kind of show you how the assembly of your tile project should be layered and come together, right? So in F103, that's got gravel for drainage. So what that means is you would place a layer of gravel over the substrate, the slab, or if it were an occupied living space, the primary roofing membrane. And then over that, you would have a mortar bed. That would be considered an unbonded mortar bed, and you would reinforce that with a wire, a 2x2 galvanized wire in the middle of the mortar bed. That's going to add quite a bit of height and also quite a bit of weight, because you're adding gravel as well as a thick mortar bed. So if you don't have the height, or you can't, your structure, you can't handle that kind of weight, won't matter for us because this is a concrete slab on ground, right, on grade. Another method is to use a drainage mat, and the diagram will show that drainage mat at the bottom. And what that does is it allows the moisture that gets into the past the tile, because we know tile and grout aren't waterproof, to seep through the mortar bed and hit the drainage mat and flow out. But over that, there's still the requirement for a mortar bed over the top of that to provide a substrate to bond our tile to. So what if you don't have that space? The minimum thickness, the industry standard for a minimum thickness of a mortar bed is 1 1/4 inches. So 1 1/4 inches plus a drainage mat that's about 3/8 of an inch thick, plus our tile installation, we're pushing what, about 2 inches, Chad?
Yeah, it adds up pretty quick.
Yeah, it adds up pretty quick. So there are other options, and it's, you can deviate from this standard and these methods if you're following a manufacturer's tested and approved method and using their products in the appropriate manner.
Manufacturer supersedes this. So if you get a manufacturer's guidelines, you're going to go with that and you'd be safe.
Exactly.
It's best to get both, but if you can get one of them, you're set.
Right. So this is going to be, what we're going to do is going to be similar to 103B with the use of a drainage mat, but this manufacturer allows us to bond our tile directly to it. So we just have the thickness of the mat and then the tile bonded directly to it, and that's going to save us a lot of height. So since we're using a manufacturer's method and following their directions, our first step is going to be to use their flashing material. And you can see with this flashing material, well, I'm not sure if you can see it.
We have a couple pieces here that we can hand out.
There are some weep holes along this edge, and what those weep holes do is allow the water that permeates the drainage mat to flow along the bottom side of it underneath our tile installation and drain through the weep holes and evacuate our tile installation, so that water is just not sitting there, and it's going to help it dry out a lot quicker and prevent us from experiencing problems with like freeze thaw or efflorescence, which is where you'll have moisture within your tile installation dry up through the surface, and you'll get like a white calcium staining, mineral staining on the surface of your tile and on the surface of your grout joints, and then you're getting your call from your customer. You're constantly going back there, scrubbing it off, and it can be a real problem. So it's always really good idea if you can evacuate that moisture out from underneath your tile assembly.
When installing that metal, you'd want to make sure that you're following the manufacturer's guidelines on the schedule as far as fastening. And if you're going to go over an occupied space, to make sure that if you are going to penetrate that there's some kind of a plan for that, right? You don't want to puncture that primary roofing membrane and then go from there, and then you're culpable on that.
Right. So with this particular method and this manufacturer's product, we've pre-installed our flashing material along the outside edge.
Now we're going to go ahead and use their taping to put it down. They have this system right here.
So what Chad's working with is a flashing tape that's made by the manufacturer of the other products that we're using, and there's a particular way that they want it to be installed. So obviously, they've gone through the trouble to put weep holes in the flashing material for us. We don't want to tape over those. Did everybody get a chance to look at the holes in there? So we're going to actually make sure that we're holding this back because we don't want to cover those up. Otherwise, it's going to defeat the purpose of our whole assembly here. We're going to get water built up on the edge, but they also have a direction in which they want that to be applied. So with this particular installation, it won't matter as much, but this is going to kind of work with this underlayment, with this drainage mat, to help the water evacuate efficiently from underneath our tile. So
we also don't want to cover up those weep holes. If we covered up those weep holes, we would prevent the system from draining, right? If you can see it in the video there, I'm making sure not to go all the way to the outside edge, covering up those weep holes, making sure I have a great bond to this.
this particular product has 2 layers, 2 strips of paper underneath it, material underneath it to cover the adhesive, so you can get it lined up and apply one side and then go through and peel back the other side. So now after he gets that in place, there's a specific tool that we use to make sure that we embed that membrane.
I don't know that we actually have that specific tool.
We do not have that specific tool up here on stage.
So it's a very small roller.
I'm going to do my best to describe it to you. It's a heavy gauge, it's a solid steel wheel, and it's got a very narrow surface area to it and handle. So you can roll it and really embed that tape into the floor and make sure that you get full contact of the adhesive that comes on the tape to the substrate that you're sticking to and to the metal to make sure that it sticks. Since something happened to our roller while our materials were sitting back on stage. Oh,
here's a very specific tool.
Rob to save the day.
How many of you guys have helpers on your job sites? They always forget to bring the tools to you when you need them. It's always their fault, right? So we've checked with the manufacturer, and after we install that flashing in our tape, we're gonna lay down our drainage mat next. It's important to keep in mind that they have a direction that they want you to lay this mat. So it's got these spacers in there that elevate and support the tile installation, but it's also designed in a way to where it allows the water to flow through optimally. So we've checked that direction and cut our sheets so that the water flows in the proper direction. It's not being held up by the mat itself. So that's an important detail to keep in mind.
You want to talk about the tape?
Yep. So now we need to install our tape. Will any fiberglass tape do, Chad?
No, they have a specific material. This manufacturer comes out with, it's got one adhesive piece in the middle, and what that's going to do is that's going to keep the mortar that you're using from going in through that joint actually bonding to the substrate, because this is supposed to be our all free-floating system. If we had thinset that was going down there, then it's not a free-floating system. But
Yeah.
it still allows the outside to be able to bond together with the thinset. So we're going to actually bond that with a thinset. That tape there is just to go ahead and block the thinset from going through there.
Yeah, prevents it from penetrating in between these panels and giving us a bond that we're not looking for to the bottom, to our substrate. So we use fiberglass tape probably every day in our tile installations, and if you didn't think ahead and order the manufacturer's tape, right? We can't go to can't go to the big box store and pick up a 2-inch roll of fiberglass alkali resistant mesh tape. That would be okay if we were installing a cement board or a fiber cement board, but we're not doing anything similar to that, so it's gonna be important to make sure that you have the correct materials on hand before you get started. With this particular system, because we're using a proprietary method by the manufacturer, what they've asked is that you're not going to grout every installation, right? So if the tile is under 15 inches and straight laid, does everybody understand what I mean? Does anybody not understand what I mean when I say straight lay? No pattern whatsoever, it's a grid. If it's less than 15 inches and a grid, then we can grout it.
With their specific
With
grout.
with a grout by that manufacturer, they list a specific one. If it's over 15 inches, because remember, this is a floating tile installation, it doesn't have that mortar bed on top of it, right? So they're very specific on how they want this done. Also on an exterior, we've got a lot of movement, so we're gonna wanna pay attention and follow their directions, right? So if it's over 15 inches, then they want us to use their silicone on every joint. And that's gonna help protect us against movement, deflection, thermal expansion and contraction, right? If it's less than 15 inches, but there's a pattern, say we've offset our tiles in a brick pattern or 1/3 offset, or even a herringbone where they overlap each other, then they've also required that we use the silicone, their specific 100% silicone sealant, to treat all of those joints instead of a grout. It sounds like a hassle, but in this particular instance, I'm standing inside my house and I've got a patio door, and I don't want my tile sticking up past the threshold of my patio door when I walk out onto my patio. So even though I'm gonna have to use a sealant on the joints probably if I'm going with a large format tile, it's gonna be worth it to me because I don't have to load my floor up 2 inches with a mortar bed and all the associated products with that method. So
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. What Chad's doing right now is he's keying his thin set into the mat. We've made sure that we're using a thin set that's recommended by the manufacturer for this system and also suitable to be used outside on the exterior in the climate that we're in. So he's keying it in. We've chosen to use a terracotta, also known as quarry tile, right? And it's pretty common, but it's less than 15 inches. It's not a large format tile. And I don't know, are you feeling creative today, Chad? Are you gonna?
No, I'm just gonna go grid pattern on this.
He's gonna go with grid pattern on this. All right, so we don't have to worry about sealing every joint, but there are some specific ways that we need to set tile outside. First of all, the industry requirements when it comes to coverage are 80% in a dry area and 95% or greater in a wet area. Now, this is outside. Exteriors are considered wet areas. So we're looking for 95% coverage or better to make sure that our tiles are properly embedded. That's also going to give us more density under our tile and prevent some of that moisture from collecting underneath our tile. But really what we're looking for is support. Our tiles need to be supported. No.
If you notice, I back troweled these tiles. That's not a recommendation, or I mean, it's not a requirement, but it is a recommendation for exterior in order to get that 95% coverage.
Right. It's got to be 95% on an exterior.
Or better.
When you're setting inside in a wet area, that's the same requirement. That would be like your shower, right? But on the exterior, we're also going to be dealing with a lot more. We're going to be dealing with freeze-thaw cycles, right? Where moisture can get in and freeze, and then when water freezes, it expands, right? Temperature swings. If you've got a cool morning, right, overnight, and you wake up and it's nice and chilly out and you've got your sweater on, you're having some coffee, depending on where you live, by noon, by the time you're eating lunch out there, the temperature might have increased 40, 50 degrees. So when that happens, all materials expand and contract with thermal energy. So when materials warm up, they expand. And when they cool down, they shrink. So aside from just needing the support, we're going to have a lot of movement, so that coverage, that 95% or greater coverage, is going to help us ensure that the tiles stay bonded, right? If we've got minimal coverage, even if the support's not an issue, we've got less material holding our tiles down and keeping them bonded. I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but what Chad's also doing as he sets over this system is he's ensuring that he's not getting thin set into the weep holes and shoving it in there and blocking those weep holes and blocking that drainage. So, when it comes to exteriors and all installations, the standards within the tile industry require us to do maintenance, right? So, in the standards, maintenance is left on the homeowner. So we're talking about caulking joints, movement joints, grout cracking, or sealant, if you sealed the joints, that sealant degrading. Well, is that our responsibility?
No, that's a homeowner's responsibility for maintenance schedule. But one of the things we can do is when we finish a job, we can come to them and ask them if they want a maintenance schedule, right? We can come by every 6 months, check their exterior, see if the caulking or the sealant is actually cracking and whatnot, repair it or replace it.
It's on the homeowner to inspect the tile installation, and especially outside, because you want to make sure all your grout joints are full, flush, not cracked. You know, you're keeping a minimal amount of moisture from getting behind the tile. We're using the drainage mat, so we know we can't block it 100%. Tile and grout are not waterproof, right? So we're going to get some moisture in there, but we want to make sure that we keep as much moisture out as possible, so that slope that's required helps evacuate it from the surface before it allows to penetrate. So I can't buy a toaster these days without being offered a service plan, you know, for an extended warranty. Some tile contractors have decided to start doing that these days and adding that to their business, because a lot of the clients that I've worked for in the past, they don't want to be responsible for that. So it's something that you can offer. So we've talked about exterior installations and following the manufacturer's guidelines, selecting the appropriate materials, drainage mats, a little bit about primary roofing membranes, but we didn't use that in this instance. Does anybody have any questions?
No questions? If you do end up having questions, we're right over here, 3938 National Tile Contractors Association. Any questions about this or becoming a member, or any other questions you might have, even out the job you're working on now?
So.
We have a program coming up pretty soon. I think it's 310 to 340 about exterior bond coats, and that's going to go more into the required amount you need for an exterior. If you can show up to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, we'll be setting tiles, showing coverage, and using different methods that we, explaining different methods that we can use to get to that minimum coverage, that requirement. So.
All right, thank you guys. I'm Chad Jones with the National Tile Contractors Association.
Hank Boyle, thank you.
Thank you.